This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This episode is brought to you by the Seed Sistas, who've been community herbalists for over 20 years. Their work took a turn last March, and they converted their passion for plants, people and the planet into an online course called The Pathway to Peace. It's an engaging 7-day immersive journey with lots of wonderful content. If you suffer from stress or anxiety, this course may well be able to offer you connection to herbs and tools for stress management, better sleep and nourishment for your nervous system. The next course starts again on April the 28th. This week's guest is Laura Erickson, talking about her brilliant book, The Love Lives of Birds. Find out why some birds mate for life, whilst others play the field, why some value age and experience, which birds lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and which birds stash their young in riverbanks, and why there's so much dancing involved. Laura begins by talking about her own love affair with birds.
I've been a bird watcher since I was 23 years old, and at the time I was in college and then a teacher and loved teaching my students about birds, and that evolved into my leading field trips and introducing adults to birds. When that all started in Michigan in the United States, and then we moved to Wisconsin. But when we moved to Duluth, Minnesota in 1981, I was a stay-at-home mother, and I became involved in a lot of local things. And that's when I also started a local radio program about birds. And so I've spent every year since 1986 producing my own little radio program about birds and answering people's questions. Over time, I got a job with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in New York. That job was as their science editor, but they specifically hired me because of my long history of answering people's questions about birds. So at that point, one of my assignments was to write a book for them through Story Publishing about, it was called the Bird Watching Answer Book. And that was what gave me the connection with the publishers. And I wrote a book for them a few years ago called Into the Nest. It's photographs and text. I was the writer and my co-author was the photo editor, and a lot of the photos in the book are hers, Mari Reed. But that book was all intimate glimpses into the courtship and nesting and raising babies. It was more technical than my current book, but the same publishers asked me to write The Love Lives of Birds. And so that's been a fun project because that's a little more fanciful than my Into the Nest book.
It is lovely. It's a beautifully written book. Just out of interest, when you did your radio show, did you record any of the bird songs for it?
Normally, I used Lang Elliott's recordings. He's a master bird recordist, and he very generously allowed me to use his recordings because I do the program entirely as a volunteer. It's been unpaid all these years. And so he's been very generous with his bird recordings. But I also did start recording birds on my own in 2000. My husband bought me a really good recorder and microphones. But I don't use my own recordings too often. Right now, this morning, spring migration is starting to kick in up here in northern Minnesota. And so I put out my recorder in the morning and see what ambient sounds I can pick up. And last year I took a whole lot of these morning recordings. I started it because of social distancing and the pandemic. All my traveling was canceled. And I was so pleased with how some of those recordings turned out that I'm doing more recording this year.
Oh, what a lovely thing. So thinking about your book, you talk about the courtships, you take specific birds and look at their courtships and mating rituals. And one thing that struck me is, sometimes we think, well, birds are birds, they're a family of animals, but their courtships are so varied. Why is that? Does anybody know?
Well, a lot of it depends on the particular needs of the individual bird species. And the interesting thing for me was that for most of the species of birds, there are some elements of their courtship rituals that are very similar to some human beings. So we have one species with a whole lot of different courtship patterns. So I guess it makes sense that individual bird species would be quite different from one another. Part of the interest that I have in bird courtship is when I look at the totality of their life. When I think about birds like bald eagles and whooping cranes and peregrine falcons and other birds that the two sexes are almost identical in appearance, and they have these ginormous territories, and they're very long-lived. And for those birds, it makes sense to commit for a lifetime, so they don't have to expend a whole lot of energy every spring trying to find a new mate where they're so widely separated. So that's probably a major factor in all those species mating for life. Now, the whooping cranes, swans, birds like that, most geese, they stay with their mate for life through the year. But some species like eagles and falcons, because they need so much hunting territory in winter, they space out even from their partners. They don't necessarily migrate together or anything. The only time they're together is at the nest. But at that point, they're very, very committed.
Yeah, that makes sense. I did think there must be some sort of correlation between, age or habitat, some sort of similarities. But one thing that did strike me reading the book is that there is a lot of dancing that goes on. And again, does anybody know why that might be?
Well, a lot of the dancing belongs with cranes and swans. The pairs are identical. Part of it is these are large birds, kind of slow moving, and the dancing is a really good, powerful evidence of an individual bird's physical stamina. And when the couple dances, like in cranes, then that is also synchronized. The dancing when they started up in the winter, our sandhill cranes and whooping cranes and the common cranes across the pond, all those birds, most of the year to fly, bird sex organs shrink. So they won't be excess baggage for the birds to be lugging around. And their bodies need to be perfectly in sync. So both the male and the female are at maximum fertility right when they're ready to lay their eggs. And the dancing helps synchronize their bodies as well as their behaviors. It's kind of an anniversary thing for couples of birds that have been together for many years, rejuvenating their whole love relationship back to the first time around. But it's synchronizing the female's ovulation with the male's production, so that when they come to their nest, finally, after the cranes are doing a long migration together, and that whole time they're getting into perfect synchrony, so they'll be ready to lay eggs at the right time. Some birds that have fancy dancing, like the grouse, species that are lekking species, where the males display, the females walk around picking out the best male as far as his fitness. She could tell this both by the condition of his plumage and by the vigorousness of his dancing. The females want to get the guy with the most, physically fit genes, so that her babies will be as physically fit as possible. So it has different functions, but they all add up to showing that the birds are in really good shape.
I was wondering why some birds have one mate and one have multiple mates. Is there a reason for that?
Yes, in some long-lived species, they can be committed for a lifetime, and it simplifies things for finding a mate. With some birds, they may individually live for 6 or 7 or even 8 and 9 years, but most of them die their first year, and they can't count on finding a mate. But also in some of the species, like wrens, mortality can be so high that they need to optimize, to maximize the number of babies they produce each year. And one of the simplest ways that the house wren uses here in America, but also I believe our winter wren, which is very closely related to your wren, what they do is they settle on a pairing and raise their babies. Both parents feed the young. And when the babies fledge, the father stays with them while the mother moves on to another territory. She's been hearing other males singing during the whole time she's been raising this brood, and moves off to one of those other singing males. The father of the original babies keeps feeding them, but he is also singing and draws in a new mate. And she can start laying eggs while he takes care of the babies. And it kind of maximizes the number of offspring that each individual bird produces in a year. Hummingbirds and grouse and quite a few other birds are promiscuous, where males will mate with as many females as possible. Some species, the female will settle in on an area near one male who's very sturdy and aggressive toward other birds. Our hummingbird, the female wants a very aggressive male, but she is never going to be with him except during the moments that they're actually mating. She does all the work at home while he's busy chasing everybody away from the flowers. But the one thing that intimidates a male hummingbird is the female. She's bigger and more aggressive than he is, so he will stay back from her. So she gets to go to the closest flowers to get her nectar and insects so she can be off the nest as short a time as possible. But he will mate with multiple mates if he can get away with it.
Oh, right. So why is the wren's mortality rate so high? Is it just because they're not very robust?
Well, because they're very tiny.
Mm.
And that makes them vulnerable. They're not the fastest flyers, and they get a lot of predation. So they have to be prolific.
And the other thing that I found really interesting was the question of age, and particularly the screech owl mating stuck out in the book. Can you talk a bit about that as well, how that sometimes works between couples of birds?
Well, most birds, when they're seeking a mate, want the oldest mate they can find. People kind of equate at a subconscious level, if not a conscious level, the idea that we're at our most peak fertility and fitness for raising children in our 20s and 30s. But birds remain fit as long as they live. One of the tragedies, but also an advantage of being a flying species with a lot of rigors of migration and predators all around, is that as you lose fitness, very quickly you die. And so birds are fit almost as long as they're alive. There is a pair of birds, albatrosses, Laysan albatrosses on Midway Island in the Pacific, that the female was banded and what UK birders call ringed back in 1956. She was an adult nesting bird, and Laysan albatrosses never start nesting until they're at least 5 years old. So in 1956, she was a minimum of 5 years old at the beginning of 1956. That means that at a minimum right now, because she is still living, and we know that because of the bands on her legs, right now she's a minimum of 70 years. And this makes the news in the United States every year now. They named her Wisdom maybe a decade ago when they realized, whoa, she's still alive. And they track her now every year. And she's not only still alive, she has one of the prime nesting territories on Midway Island. She laid an egg this year. They only lay one egg, and the baby has hatched, and she and her mate are raising it. And they have no idea how old her mate is. I think it's the second or third mate they've tracked to her since they discovered maybe 15 years ago that she was still living. But she's still fertile at a minimum of 70 years. Meanwhile, all those 70 years, think about the history that she has experienced on Midway Island, from tsunamis to aircraft flying over. Midway Island is where the United States had a base during World War II, but then that was probably before she was hatched, but then they reactivated that base where jet aircraft was flying in and out starting in the 50s, which is when they started the project. The original plan was to kill all the albatrosses on that island so they wouldn't interfere with jets taking off and landing. And the biologist who happened to ban her was the one who proposed to the Defense Department, hey, why don't we study these birds, see where they need to take off and land, and see if there's substrates that are uncomfortable on their feet that we could put around the runways and situate the runways so they work well for aircraft, but not for albatrosses. And the Defense Department said, sure. So that's why she's ringed in the first place. But it's also why we know that she's the only known bird who is older than me in the wild, and she is still raising a baby every year. So she has all that experience, and that's why she is the most desirable mate. And in most species of birds, they want the older mate, the oldest mate they can find, because they want all that experience. Several kinds of birds have physical ways of showing how old they are. With the accipiter hawks, like your sparrowhawk, as the first year that their first spring, when they're a year old, they have adult plumage, but their eyes are yellow. And year after year, the eyes get orange and then brilliant red. And at that point, you can't tell how old they are anymore, but we know that they're at least 3 or 4 years old. And the birds use that for picking their mate. And a young bird really wants a bird with red eyes, but the red-eyed bird can look at the potential mate and say, wait, you just have yellow eyes. I don't want you. So they sort each other out, and the older birds end up with older mates. And that's the way it usually works. With waxwings, your waxwing, we have cedar and what we call Bohemian waxwings here, but you guys have waxwings, which are the same as our Bohemians. They have these little tiny red spots on their secondary wing feathers, and it's not like tree rings where you get one every year, but they get more as they get older, and the waxwings sort themselves out because the oldest, most desirable birds get to choose the oldest, most desirable mates, and the younger ones end up with each other. And that is a system that works. Now, the two birds you brought up were the blue-footed booby and the screech owl. And with those, the screech owls, we know they have what we call assortative mating, where they mate with a similar aged bird all the time. If an older bird loses its mate, in most species, they try to get the oldest mate they can. But screech owls, they tend to replace their mate with a mate that's their same age, and no one knows how they identify those birds. It probably has to do with plumage differences that we cannot see with our mere human eyes. It may be something in the ultraviolet spectrum that they can look at each other and recognize the same age bird, because as far as we know, they don't carry any identification that would give their age. The opposite thing happens with blue-footed boobies, where the pairs that have the most reproductive success tend to be one young bird and one older bird. And it doesn't matter whether it's the male or female who's the younger or the older, but the different ages, for some unknown reason, have greater reproductive success than either two older birds or two younger birds. One of the wonderful things for me about ornithology is how the more we know, the more we learn about these birds, the more questions we still have.
I know I had so many questions reading the book, and I thought, I'm sure that's not even been researched yet. But it, like you say, you sort of scratch the surface and you think, well, why on earth are they doing that? We need to know. So there are some commonalities, I think, between the birds that you have over in the States and the ones that we have here. And I'm thinking about the brown-headed cowbird, which sounds a little bit like our UK cuckoo. So is there a kind of reason that some birds just don't build their own nests? You know, why are they parasitic on other birds' nests? Do we know that?
We've never entirely figured it out. We have cuckoos fairly closely related to your cuckoos here in the United States, but they're not nest parasites, or only occasionally, but only in their same species of cuckoo, where your cuckoos don't build a nest in the first place. And they have been so well known for so long. There's lots of Shakespearean references to cuckoos, and the very word cuckold comes from cuckoo. But we have the brown-headed cowbird, and we understand one thing about brown-headed cowbirds. When people from the UK first arrived in America back in the 16 and 1700s, when people from the UK first came to America in the 16 and 1700s, our brown-headed cowbirds lived exclusively in the Great Plains states following bison. And in our Great Plains, the grass you don't feel soil when you reach to the bottom of the grass. There's a thick layer of sod. And brown-headed cowbirds eat food in the soil. They eat invertebrates that are actually in the soil. So they associated with bison because the bison, their hooves broke up the sod, and they could follow them and be getting food on the disturbed soil and also eating some bugs on the bison's back. Well, when the first settlers reached the Great Plains, they were decimating the bison, but at the exact same time, they were bringing in a substitute large mammal, cattle, and the cowbirds started following the cattle around. It was the same difference. They were getting disturbed soil and the invertebrates they needed. But in the meantime, before that, when they followed the bison, if a brown-headed cowbird was ready to lay her eggs and built a nest and put the eggs in it, the bison were nomadic and they would move on. And now either she and the babies would starve if she stayed at the nest, or the babies would starve if she moved on. And so it made sense that they would lay their eggs in the nests of birds that didn't depend on the bison, so that those birds could feed the cowbird babies. It's very complex, though. That is not the whole story, because relatives of the cowbird who are not associated with large mammals still have that, what we call brood parasitism, like the cuckoos. But it does kind of explain the quandary the cowbirds would have been in had they had to make their own nest. They choose species like the cuckoos that are smaller than they are. In both cases, it makes it hard for the mother bird or father bird whose nest it is to throw out the egg, because the egg's too big for their beak to pick up. Our cowbirds stay in the nest. They do not hurt the babies on purpose. But sometimes, like with one of our endangered birds, the black-capped vireo, the babies are inside the egg for like almost 3 weeks, while the cowbirds hatch out after only 8 or 9 days. And so the cowbird has a chance to be very big before the little vireos even hatch, and they get trampled. But they don't get thrown out the way cuckoos. The very first instinct the baby cuckoo has the moment it hatches is to get rid of everything in the nest with it, and it'll push out eggs or chicks.
Yeah. Well, they are pretty mean. I have to say, it's good to hear them in the spring, but they're not the nicest of birds. But then I guess they're just surviving. And the other interesting bird that you talked about in the book, which is really interesting in terms of where they nest, was the kingfisher. Would you mind just talking briefly about what they do?
Well, our kingfisher nests in banks, often alongside rivers, and they excavate the bank themselves. They have a very large bill that's very strong, rather similar to a woodpecker. And they use that bill both for carrying fish that they catch, but also for excavating this bank. They have tiny feet, surprisingly small feet, but their feet are thickened at the where the toes come together, and they use their feet as their beak is, digging in ahead of them, working on this tunnel. Their feet are pushing out away all the dirt so that they end up having this nice little tunnel. And within the tunnel, they make a little, a whole little chamber where they have their eggs. And it's very dark in there. The entrance can be 2 or even 3 feet long before you get to the chamber. And so it is quite dark. And the parents, when they're feeding the young, they have to be feeling them out. And the babies have this powerful instinct to huddle together. And it's sort of an all for one and one for all situation, because if the parents are going to find one of the babies, and all the rest will be right there, so they all get fed. And they shuttle around. Whatever they do in that nest chamber, they do it together. And it's so interesting to me, because there are few birds as genuinely solitary when they leave the nest as kingfishers. But during that nestling period, they are so tightly, almost literally woven together.
Yeah, I thought that was lovely. I really like the story of them. And I think the last question I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, is the question about the need for privacy when mating. And, I kind of assume animals that aren't that bashful when it comes to that sort of thing, but apparently some of them are.
birds are very vulnerable when they're not consciously aware of their surroundings. While they're feeding, birds like woodcock, their eyes are situated so they can sort of see the ground. They're mainly probing and feeling and smelling for their food, but their eyes are situated so the whole time they're eating, they're looking in every direction above themselves where predators could be coming. They have to be aware of their surroundings at all times. But in the throes of passion, they may not be paying enough attention to predators. And so they tend to try to find a place where they can mate without predators being able to detect them. And they also tend to be pretty quick about it. And it's all just for survival.
Was there one where it didn't actually like to mate because its offspring was nearby?
The scrub jay. Crows and jays and ravens and magpies, what we call corvids, are many of the species, young birds, especially males, when they're 1 year old, stay near their parents and may help their parents with all kinds of things. But the parents, they still like a little privacy. Even really astute birders have seldom seen these birds mating. And yet they mate fairly regularly. Our American robin, which is related to your blackbird, mates early in the morning when, during the time at first light, when they can detect worms on the ground, is also when they mate for the day. And the rest of the day, they're busy with, she's working on the nest, he's declaring the territory and bringing her some, building materials and maybe offering advice. But they're busy with their normal activities. And then when they stop mating, that's when she starts incubating the eggs. But they have that one time where they can actually think about breakfast in a romantic situation. And that's when they do it. And so you have to be alert in that low light situation. They're out in the open, but it's low light.
A very big thank you to Laura for taking part in the interview. It contained its fair share of phone beeps, musical clock chimes, and Kev next door's cows in the background. But isn't that what podcasting's all about and why we love it? Thank you for listening and for putting up with me, and thanks to the Seed Sistas for supporting this episode. Please also check out their online course in sensory herbalism, which starts in just over 2 weeks' time. I'll leave you with Dr. Ian Bedford talking about a bug that I've seen lots of pictures of on social media this past week, so I think it's timely.
Possibly the most important, yet unappreciated group of insects on Earth are the dipterans, the flies. With an estimated 1 million species of flies, it's not surprising that they form the most diverse group of organisms on the planet. Flies differ from other flying insects, though, by the fact that they only have one pair of wings, the hind wings having evolved over time into little stick-like organs called halteres that give the flies their amazing ability to perform rapid direction changes when in flight. And we only have to look around our houses and gardens to realise that there's an awful lot of different flies that exist within our own personal living spaces. From houseflies in the kitchen, to blowflies buzzing around the wheelie bins, hoverflies predating aphids, cranefly in the lawn, and various biting flies such as horseflies and mosquitoes feeding on our blood. And so, within this vast community of flies that we live amongst, there's always going to be something interesting to see, and perhaps to learn about, and understand the role that particular fly has to play within the local ecosystem. And one such fly, commonly seen in gardens across southern Britain during spring, is the fascinating large bee fly. So called because this totally harmless fly mimics the appearance of a small bumblebee, having a plump, furry body and flying amongst the low-growing plants, emitting a high-pitched hum. However, its swept-back wings, the lack of hind wings, and a long, needle-like proboscis protruding from its head clearly identifies it as a bee fly. A fly that, unlike a bumblebee, is a very accomplished flyer, instantaneously darting away from moving shadows whilst it visits flowers to feed on their nectar. Their flying skills and mimicry undoubtedly helps them avoid being eaten by insectivorous birds, but it may also serve another purpose. Since the large bee fly is actually a parasite and, looking like a bumblebee, might enable it to get close enough to its victims, the solitary mining bees, for the females to perform the essential egg-laying part of their life cycle. Having located a colony of mining bees, the female bee flies hover discreetly around the entrance holes, whilst the mining bees obliviously continue tunnelling and constructing the underground chambers for their larvae. Then, with a quick flicking movement of her body, the female begins lobbing eggs into the mining bees' nests. Over time, the eggs hatch, and the bee fly maggots start to feed on the food that had been stored for the mining bee larvae, and then they feed on the larvae itself, eventually maturing, pupating, and hatching into an adult bee fly from the tunnels where the new mining bees should have emerged. So besides being an interesting fly to watch in the garden, the bee flies are actually serving a purpose in not only helping to pollinate plants, but in managing the colony sizes of the underground dwelling mining bees.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.